at this one. So this episode that I've just pulled up is the one that we didn't watch from yesterday. It's about Ivan the Terrible. Um, one of the actually was he the first Tsar of Russia? I'm shaky on my history.
Sometimes a person can be so cruel, so monstrous, so
The reason why we didn't watch this one yesterday is because it's almost half an hour long. But we'll watch this today.
terrible that it actually becomes part of their name, like Ivan the Terrible, notorious Russian Tsar of the 16th century. But even an evil despot's got to eat, and that's why I'm going to be making one of the most popular foods of 16th century Russia, cabbage piroshki. So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we ask the question, why was Ivan so terrible? This time on Tasting History.
I love this channel. Please, chat and YouTube audience, in case if I put this on YouTube, please go sub to Tasting History, because they actually it's actually really cool videos. If you are like history like me and you like
Ivan
food like me,
better
you'll
known
like this
in
channel.
English as Ivan the Terrible, was crowned the first Tsar of Russia in 1547.
He was the first Tsar of Russia.
And just to put that into perspective with the rest of European history, that is the same year that Henry VIII died and almost 40 years after Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel. So while most of Europe was well into the Renaissance, Russia under Tsar Ivan was very much still medieval. And what's interesting is that when it comes to medieval food, usually we know a lot about what the kings and the emperors ate and very little about what the common folk ate, but in Russia, it's exactly the opposite. While there are descriptions of Ivan or Ivan, I'll probably go back and forth, Ivan's feasts at different times, it almost never talks about exactly what food he was eating. But during his reign, something called Domostroy, which was a household management book, was published, and it does talk about a lot of the foods that the more common people, wealthy common people, but still common people, were eating. It's not really full of recipes, but it does give some good descriptions. Like something that probably actually would have been on Tsar Ivan's table would be swan basted with honey, swan giblets mixed with saffron and croutons, swan neck spiced with saffron. They put croutons on the swan's neck also. Around here, the croutons are made of white bread and fried in butter. Not exactly a recipe, and finding swan is pretty much impossible, as it should be. So I looked at two other foods that were very common and would have been available to pretty much everyone, despite how wealthy they were, and that is the many, many types of fish soup that they had, and small pies filled with mushrooms, poppy seeds, kasha, turnips, cabbage, or whatever else God sends. These small pies, which could also have fish or fruit or meat or pretty much anything inside, were called and are called piroshki. That is not the same as a pierogi, which is a type of dumpling from Poland, but piroshki just meaning a small pie. Actually, it means multiple small pies. A singular is a pirozhok, and then a singular large pie is a pirog. Sadly, the Domostroy does not give us an actual recipe for these hand pies, but it does give us a clue as to what the breading on the outside would be.
Up on my
When the
Russian here.
servants bake bread, order them to set some of the dough aside to be stuffed for piroshki. It's a start. Now, the common people would have probably had rye bread, but Tsar Ivan would have definitely been eating wheat bread at this time. And lucky for me, the recipe has not really changed over the years. At least from the 18th century, when we start to get recipes for this kind of thing, it's pretty much the same thing as it is now. So as long as the ingredients were around in the 16th century, I feel comfortable using them. So I am going to make one of the fillings that is most common in Russia today and would have been common then as well, and that is cabbage and onion piroshki, for which you will need a quarter cup or 60 milliliters of cooking oil. Poppy seed oil was actually what was being used mostly in Russia at the time, but you could just use olive oil. It's going to be a lot easier to find. Then 1 large yellow onion, diced up, 2 cloves of garlic, minced up fine, 1 medium head of cabbage, about 2 pounds. Remove the outside leaves and chop it into thin strips or even small pieces, and leave the stalk because that is going to be too firm to use in this recipe. Then 2 tablespoons of butter, a quarter cup of fresh dill chopped fine, 1 teaspoon of salt, and 1 teaspoon of pepper. So start by heating the oil in a large pot over a medium-high heat, and then add the onion and coat it in the oil, then toss in the salt and let the onion cook in a single layer for about 5 minutes. Then add in the garlic and continue to cook for another minute, and then reduce the heat to medium-low and make sure that the onions are in a single layer covering the bottom of the pot, on which you can layer on all of the cabbage. Then set the lid on the pot and let it cook for 30 minutes. And once in a while, lift the lid of the pot, and if you can't hear any sizzling, then just add a little bit of liquid. This can be either more oil or a little bit of water. Either one works. After 30 minutes, the cabbage should be pretty well cooked, and you can add in the butter as well as the pepper and stir all of that in. Let it cook for another 15 minutes and then add the dill. And at this point you can actually be done with the filling, but if you let it continue to cook for a little while, the cabbage itself will start to caramelize just like the onions, and so it gets a little sweet and it's absolutely delicious. Either way, when it's done to your liking, you can take it off the heat, add a little more salt if you need it, and then let it cool completely. Ideally, you actually put it in the refrigerator, because if it is nice and cold, it will be easier to form the pierogi. And speaking of cold, it is getting to that time of year when the leaves start falling and you just feel like getting nice and cozy.
This is an ad.
So might I suggest a nice cozy pair of
Ha! I got it.
Make the dough for our pierogi, for which you will need 4 cups
I've
or
been in the
500
game
grams
too
of
long.
flour, 1 packet or 7 grams of dry active yeast, 2 teaspoons of salt, a 1/3 cup or 65 grams of sugar, a 1/2 cup or 120 milliliters of whole milk, a 1/2 cup or 120 milliliters of heavy cream, 2 eggs, and 4 tablespoons or 55 grams of melted unsalted butter. So the first thing to do is activate the dry yeast by mixing it in with about half of the milk and a large pinch of the sugar. Then whisk together the flour, the salt, and the remaining sugar, and then add the activated yeast along with the milk and the cream and the eggs, basically everything but the butter. Mix all of this together until it starts to form a dough, and then turn it out onto the counter and start to knead it. It is a bit sticky at first, but it actually comes together pretty quickly, and in about 10 minutes of kneading, you should have a nice smooth dough. Then here is where you can start adding in the melted butter, just a little bit at a time. Simply dip your fingers in the butter and rub it into the dough and begin kneading it in. After just a few kneads, the butter should work its way in and you can go back for a little more butter. But at a certain point, it will take longer and longer for that butter to work into the dough, and I'd say if you have to knead it for more than 30 seconds to get it to incorporate, then that is enough butter. Don't feel like you have to use it all up. Rather, use a bit to butter the inside of a bowl, then set the dough in, cover it, and let it rest for 90 minutes to 2 hours or until it has doubled in size. Now, I was actually torn between making the pierogi and another dish that was very, very common amongst all people in Russia at the time, and that is a fish soup, often called ucha. And there are all kinds of these fish soups. At a single Christmas feast in the Domostroj, it talks about different pies coming out, and then roast meats and roast fish, tons of different caviars, and then blackfish soup, burbot soup, pike soup spiced with pepper, soup made from perch, roach, bream, carp, beluga, and sterlet.
Beluga?
Soup thickened with wheat flour, soup served with bread, sterlet soup, pike perch soup, soup made from sterlet guts. And as tempting as sterlet guts are, I just had a big old
soup goes
for
hard
some
though.
pierogi, so that's what I decided to
Good chicken noodle soup.
make. So before we wrap and bake our pierogi, let's look at another man who really
broccoli and
enjoyed
cheddar
his
soup,
pierogi,
too.
but he did it while terrorizing the people of 16th century Russia. So before we look at why Ivan was so terrible, we need to clear something up, and that is the name terrible, or the word terrible. Often you'll see that it is a mistranslation, and it kind of is, but it's also kind of not. What it really is that the word terrible today has different connotations than it did when it was first translated from the Russian Ivan Grozny. It didn't mean awful or cruel, but rather fearsome and formidable. And he was all of those things. He was fearsome and formidable and awful and cruel. And some say that that was kind of baked in from the moment he was conceived. See, his father, Vasily III, Grand Prince of Muscovy, which at that time was a relatively small territory centered in Moscow, divorced his wife when she couldn't give him a child, and then he went on to marry a girl 20 years younger who was able to
Oh.
give him a son, actually 2 sons. But just as the Catholic Church had forbidden Henry VIII from divorcing his wife for pretty much the same reason, so too did the Orthodox Church forbid Vasily, and just like Henry, Vasily didn't really seem to care. But unlike Henry, he didn't have to go start a whole new church to do it. He just declared that his wife was a witch and moved on, and everybody was like, well, okay, fine. However, one priest was said to have cursed him, saying that an evil deed, that being divorce, would produce an evil child. And on a dark and stormy night, August 25th, 1530, that evil child was born, and they named him Ivan. Of course, no baby, except for Damien from The Omen, is actually born evil. No, for Ivan to go bad, bad things had to happen to him. And they started with the death of his father when he was only 3. Now, before he died, his father made the boyars, who were the ruling aristocracy in Muscovy at the time, he made them vow allegiance to his 3-year-old son, Ivan. And they did. But obviously, he couldn't rule at 3 years old, so his mother took over and she ruled in his stead as regent, but then she died when he was 8, probably poisoned by the boyars who had sworn fealty to him. See, the boyars wanted to control Ivan and his brother, and so then they would control Muscovy, and that's exactly what happened. He and his brother were passed around from boyar family to boyar family as they fought between themselves, and he and his brother were still in the palace, but they were treated really as prisoners. And it was pretty terrible, at least if you believe the letters that are said to have been written by Ivan himself. He wrote, "My brother Yuri, of blessed memory, and I were brought up like vagrants and children of the poorest. They began to feed us as though we were foreigners or the most wretched menials. What have I suffered through lack of clothing and hunger?" And that sort of upbringing probably planted the seeds for what Ivan would end up becoming. And it didn't take very long for him to start becoming what he would, because at the age of 13, he held a banquet where he stood up and declared that the then regent, the person who was kind of running things, Andrei Shusky, was a traitor and had been mismanaging the area, and so he had him summarily executed. Some say that he was beaten to death, and some say he was torn apart by dogs. Either way, that was the end of anyone taking advantage of Ivan, and not long after, he was elevated from prince to Tsar Ivan IV, becoming the first Tsar. Others had actually used that term before. His grandfather did, his father did, but none of them were officially called that, and he was the first to have that as his official title. And it came from the word Caesar or Kaiser, and it was a way for him to make a connection with the Roman Empire, which was still looming large in the minds of most Europeans. And for a while, they would actually call Moscow the Third Rome. There was obviously Rome, then Constantinople, and now Moscow. Now, at first, everything seemed to go pretty well. He made nice with the Orthodox Church.
Which is kind of funny because Russia was made by the Rus, which are like a group of Swedish Vikings that came over the Baltics into the Russian area, right? So they were obviously pagans, but Constantinople and the Roman Empire became incredibly Christian.
He married a young woman named Anastasia Romanovna, and he laid out a revised law code which curtailed some of the unchecked powers of the boyars over the people. He also brought in Russia's first printing press and helped to unify the church, making Muscovy the cultural capital of what was still a rather fractured Russia. Muscovy was still at this time a relative backwater, just kind of the lands around Moscow, and to the west there were powerful kingdoms that were all Catholic, and then to the south and the east there were powerful Islamic Khanates, those being the remnants of the Golden Horde, descendants from another historical villain, Genghis Khan. And it was those areas, the former Mongol areas, that Ivan was determined to conquer first. He created Russia's first standing army, and in 1552 brought the Khanate of Kazan, a place which had withstood at least 10 Russian sieges over the last 60 years, into his domain. To celebrate, he ordered a new cathedral built, the iconic St. Basil's, which still stands to this day. Ivan must have been on cloud 9. If he kept this up, he would go down in history known as Ivan the Great. But we know that that's not what happened, so what went wrong? Well, it all started when he got sick. And if you watched my video recently on Caligula...
I was just about to say, Caligula, this sounds very similar.
It's kind of crazy how many parallels there are between Ivan and Caligula.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Especially in the early part of their lives. They both had both parents die, then at least one of those parents was murdered, and they both had to go live with the people who were probably responsible for the murder. Both of them actually started their reigns as heroes, and then both of them started to go bad when they got sick. And for Ivan, that was in 1553. And they thought he was going to die, and so just like his father, when he was about to die, he had the boyars come to swear allegiance to his son, who was an infant at the time. But unlike his father, there were some of the boyars who did not swear allegiance, or were just kind of like, let me get back to you, and they never did. Well, he got better, and he won happy, and so he had them executed. And the next few years didn't really help matters. It didn't make Ivan any cheerier. First, his eldest son died, and then he began a war against Livonia, modern-day Latvia and Estonia, which blew up into a bigger war against the much larger powers of Lithuania, Poland, and Sweden, and that lasted for 25 years. Then the country was ravaged by drought and famine. Then his greatest friend and top general, Prince Kurbsky, defected to the Lithuanians, and to top it all off, his wife Anastasia died, likely from poisoning by the boyars, who Ivan had learned, or at least suspected, were embezzling money from him. It's no wonder the guy snapped, and so on December 3rd, 1564, he up and left Moscow, leaving a letter saying that he was abdicating. He had had it officially. Well, the boyars were thrilled. They were now able to run Muscovy for themselves. Unfortunately, the people were not thrilled. They did still like Ivan, and so it was unruly, and it made it so that the boyars had to go to him and beg him to come back and be Tsar again. And he agreed under one condition. He wanted to split the area up into two. The south would pretty much still be run the same way that it always had been, but then in the north, he would have complete, absolute, and unchecked power. He could take anything he wanted, he could confiscate estates, he could kill anyone that he wanted for pretty much any reason, and neither the boyars nor the church could do anything about it. And they agreed to this. And this
what a deal.
Ivan IV really becomes Ivan the Terrible. One of the first things he did was to establish the Oprichniki, a sort of militarized secret police who terrorized the people for no other reason than that they could, though usually under the guise of rooting out traitors. They were headed by Malyuta Skuratov, who Ivan used to do his dirtiest of dirty work. Malyuta was put in charge of the execution of Ivan's only cousin and claimant to the throne, and he personally strangled Philip II, the Metropolitan, or essentially Archbishop, of Moscow. Then Ivan put him in charge of perhaps the worst thing that Ivan did during his entire reign, and that was the massacre of Novgorod. Now, the city was a relatively new addition to Tsar Ivan's domain, and he became suspicious that the leading citizens were planning to defect and place the city under the control of Lithuania. So in 1570, Ivan ordered the Oprichniki to go in and sack the city, sort of a, if I can't have you, then nobody can situation. Oh, the lamentable outcries and cruel slaughters, drowning and burning, ravaging of women and maids, stripping them naked without mercy or regard of the frozen weather, tying and binding them by 3 and by 4 at their horse tails, dragging them, some alive, some dead, all bloodying the ways and streets, full of carcasses of the aged men and women and infants. It said that they would strap people to sleighs and push them down hills into icy lakes to drown. A large portion of the population was killed, and it was remembered for generations. I suppose the only real bright spot, if you can call it that, of this entire period was that in 1572, he actually disbanded the Oprichniki, because it turns out that while they were great at fighting helpless peasants and old women, they were not so great when an actual army of Tartars invaded Russia, and they just completely melted away, and so the Tartars destroyed Moscow, burning pretty much everything to the ground except for the Kremlin. And that was pretty much the end of Ivan's unchecked power. He didn't really do much after that. He was a bit demoralized, I guess. He did get married a lot. He was said to have been married at least 6 times, possibly 8 or even 9 times. Again, kind of similar to Henry VIII. And then he raised sons and children, and his eldest son he raised to be a great general, and he was poised to become the next Tsar. But, unfortunately for him, his father, Ivan, still had one more terrible deed left in him. On November 16, 1581, he and his son had a disagreement, possibly over an immodest dress that the younger man's pregnant wife was wearing. This led Ivan to fly into an uncontrollable rage, and he hit his son over the head with his staff. His son collapsed, and he died a few days later.
No.
Ivan immediately regretted what he had done, and it pretty much destroyed him. Over the next 3 years, he didn't really accomplish anything. He's often credited with conquering Siberia simply because he was the Tsar at the time, but really it was done by the Stroganov family, who many centuries later would have a beef dish named after them. No, Ivan's terrible life was done. In 1584, he died, likely of a stroke, but possibly by poison, while playing chess. Unfortunately, because he had murdered his very capable elder son, the throne passed to his younger son, Fyodor, who was feeble-minded at best and never produced any heir. And so when he left the throne, Russia fell into a period of anarchy known as the Time of Troubles. And it only ended when a new family came to power. And it was actually Ivan's first wife, the one who was poisoned, Anastasia Romanov's great nephew, Mikhail Romanov, who finally restored order and established the Romanov dynasty, which lasted until 1917. Now, even though Ivan was, in fact, terrible, even terrible people have to eat.
Look at that.
And most of what we know about how he ate actually comes from the writings of an English diplomat who came in the latter part of his reign. He came to Russia and wrote about a feast that he saw. Ivan is served at his table on this manner. First, every dish is tasted by the cook in the presence of the high steward or his deputy. At the table, a taste of every dish is given to the taster, and so placeth it before the emperor. The number of his dishes for his ordinary service is about 70, dressed somewhat grossly with much garlic and salt, much after the Dutch manner. This service is sent up by 2 dishes at a time, or 3 at most, that he may eat it warm. First the baked, then the roast meats, then last the broths. The taster holdeth the cup that he drinketh in all dinner time, and delivereth it unto him with a way when he calleth for it. After dinner he layeth him down to rest, where commonly he taketh 3 hours' sleep. And this custom for sleeping after dinner is an ordinary matter with him, as with all the Russes. It's that after dinner nap that I can really get on board with. That and the extensive amount of garlic, which is why I made sure to include garlic in these piroshki, which should be ready to form. So once your dough has doubled in size, divide it into about 20 pieces, around 45 grams apiece. Then fold the outsides of each piece into the center and roll them into balls. Take the ball of dough and use a rolling pin to roll it into a circle about 4 to 4.5 inches wide. You want it nice and thin. Then take the filling, which should be cold by now, and add a little to the center of the circle of the dough, making it into a sort of line of filling rather than having it all right in the middle. If you've weighed the pieces of dough, you're looking to add about 3/4 of that weight in filling. So my dough balls were 45 grams and the filling was about 35 grams. You can, of course, just eyeball it as well. Once the filling is in, fold up the longer sides and pinch the dough together. Then, to make sure it's sealed, fold that dough in on itself in a line down the ridge of the dough and pinch the ends. Then flip it over and set it, sealed side down, on a lined baking sheet and repeat until all the filling is used up. Then brush
Okay.
on a light egg wash with either just egg or egg and cream and set it in the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 205 Celsius to bake for 15 to 18 minutes or until
These
they're
look
well
pretty good.
browned on the outside. And then let them cool for a little bit.
If
but
they were
definitely
filled with like ground beef or something different, I would love these.
serve them warm. And here they are.
I could go without the cabbage,
and
but
onion
like
piroshki fit for the table
maybe some like
of Tsar
onions,
Ivan
ground
the
beef,
Terrible.
something like that.
I have to say, I'm really proud of how these turned out. They're so pretty. They're also, the bread is so soft. Yeah, and you open it up and you just see all that filling in there. Let's give it a try. That is so good. The onion is dominant, it's nice and sweet, but the garlic and the dill really add to the flavor and give it some depth. But you can make, there are so many different types. Often today, this is made with hard-boiled egg in it, so you can add that if you want. There are also many of these that are deep fried. It's a different type of dough, and they would
Okay.
have also had fried versions, even in the 16th century. The
Fried
Demosthenes
sounds
does
pretty good,
talk about
actually.
that, but most of them
Doesn't sound
were
too bad.
baked. It was just more common, and frankly, I think they're better baked than even fried. So I wanted to share one interesting historical what if that I came across while researching this video,
Ooh.
and that is in 1570, Ivan the Terrible proposed marriage to Queen Elizabeth I of England. Now, partly it said that it was because not that he loved her, but he needed to possibly escape. He was very worried about being assassinated, so he was looking for some place that would take him, and most of Europe did not like him. So England was the place to go, but seeing as she was notoriously the Virgin Queen and would never marry, she turned him down. Probably reminded her too much of her own father. Well,
Yeah.
Ivan, being terrible, sent her a letter calling her names and saying that she didn't even act like a real queen and she was like a
Wow.
commoner, and that it was actually the men running the country. And then he finishes it off saying that she was an old maid. So yeah, she really dodged a bullet there. But how
Wow.
interesting would things have turned out if that marriage
That,
had
yeah.
ended up happening? Anyway,
Wow.
yeah, that is Ivan the Terrible.
Huh.
These, though, not terrible. These are freaking delicious. I'm so glad that I made like 2 dozen, and I will be eating all 2 dozen. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Wow. Good episode. Those do look really good. If we do a cooking stream, we will make those. I promise, we will make those.